Welcome to this episode of Crops TV. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University, with the Iowa Nutrient Research Center and the Department of Ag and Biosystems Engineering. I'm going to talk today about nitrate reduction from field to stream and look forward to our dialogue today. Hopefully you'll have some questions at the end, and I have my contact information in there as well. Always feel free to get in touch if you have questions, comments, or want to discuss something that's talked about today. So one of the reasons that we are worried about nitrate loss from our agricultural lands is related to the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's a zone that in the summer of each year in the Gulf, we get low dissolved oxygen, so low that it can't support aquatic life. And they attribute that hypoxic zone and the growth of that over time to increased nutrient loading down the Mississippi River. So in 2008, the Hypoxia Action Plan came out with goals to reduce the size of the zone to about 5,000 square kilometers, so about the size of Rhode Island. And there was an EPA Science Advisory Board report that recommended to reach those goals for the size of the zone, we needed to see a 45% reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus loads down the Mississippi River. And so we're going to talk primarily here about nitrate reduction, which is the primary form of nitrogen that we are concerned with. This map or this graph here just shows kind of the long-term average as of 2014 in that kind of light blue bar versus the task force goal there in the black bar. So the size of the zone has consistently been above that 5,000 square kilometers. Those years where we see it closer to 5,000 square kilometers are years where we have less flow down the river and less nutrient loading as a result of that. The Hypoxia Action Plan also led to the development of the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, because in the action plan, one of the action items was for each state that's part of the Mississippi River Basin Hypoxia Task Force was to develop a action plan, state-level action plan for how they would go about reducing nutrient loading or nutrient reduction strategy for that state. That's really what led to the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. So as we look at Iowa, one of the things that is happening is there's a monitoring of statewide nitrogen loads that really exit the state of Iowa. And so this data is also included in the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy annual report. And so the triangles are the nitrate load, the diamonds are the flow that we see, exiting the state on an annualized basis. So we can see, since 2007 or 8, we've had fairly high nitrate load between 300 and 400,000 tons per year. You'll notice in 2012, a year with less flow, we saw that load less than 100,000 tons. So as we look at this, that load that we see coming from the state in any given year is closely related to the flow, which makes sense. The flow or precipitation and then flow is really the driver for that nutrient loss. Okay, so one of the things that we have to think about is, if we see years with increasing precipitation or intensity of precipitation, that may exacerbate the nitrate load that we see coming from our agricultural systems. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about what we can do, or actually hopefully a lot about what we can do to reduce downstream nitrate load from field to stream. And so really as we think about this, we need to kind of protect ourselves at each of those points along the way to reduce downstream nitrate delivery. I think it is important to step back and think about, why do we see these high nitrate loads exiting the state of Iowa, and why have we seen an increase throughout time? And I think one of the primary reasons that we can look at is we've transitioned Iowa from a perennial or diverse cropping system to primarily a corn and soybean cropping system. And so this is looking at USDA data stretching back into the 1920s that looks at corn acres, soybean acres, oat acres, and then combined corn, soybean, and oat acres. And so what we see is, this is kind of interesting. We've grown on average about 10 million acres of corn since the 1920s. So when some people talk about an exponential increase in corn acres, really since the 20s we've been between 10 and 14 million acres. But what's changed is that blue curve, or the curve that starts essentially at zero in the 20s and moves up to about 10 million acres in 2019, and that's our soybean acres. So we've and then the upside down triangle is the oats. And so we see, in the 20s and 30s, we had over 5 million acres of oats. But then you can see by the 1980, we had between maybe 1 and 2 million acres. So as we think about this, we've seen an increase in soybean acres, and a decrease in oat acres. If we were to look at pasture or hay ground acres, those would also decrease. So really what we've seen, we've transitioned from a more diverse cropping system to primarily that annual row crop system of corn and soybeans, which would be using water, taking up nutrients, kind of similar time of the year, whereas a more diverse system, we might have been taking up nutrients, taking up water, different times of the year rather than primarily in the summer period. So as we think about this is a slide that colleague Dr. Mike Castellano put together that illustrates this kind of rate of soil nitrate production from native soil organic matter. So in Iowa and a lot of the Midwest, we are very fortunate to have soils with abundant native soil organic matter. There's a lot of organic nitrogen in there. When soils get warm and moist in the spring, we can convert some of that organic nitrogen pool into the nitrate form. That's what is illustrated by that red line. And then where we have our corn soybean cropping system, that uptake, when that plant's growing, when it's taking up water and nutrients, might be more illustrated by that green line. So if you look at that red line versus the green line, one of the problems is they're not happening at the same time. Those peaks aren't happening. There's kind of transitioned a little bit later when we're taking that up. Now, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem, except if we think about Iowa, when do we get a lot of our excess precipitation? And that's going to happen in that early, April, May, early June period when we have precipitation in excess of what can be held in the soil or what could be used by the plant. That water then may move through the soil profile and take nitrate with it. And so if we think about some of the more diversified cropping system, if we think about oats, for example, they may start growing a little earlier in the year. And so that red line and green line may match up a little bit closer so that there's maybe less risk of nitrate loss. We can also think about it if we were to have a perennial. Historically, a lot of Iowa was in tall grass prairie. And so we could envision that, that red line might stay somewhat similar because, we still would convert organic nitrogen into the nitrate form. But we may have vegetation out there that grows a greater percentage of the year so that green line more closely matches that red line. So I'd like you to think about that. I don't have exactly what the red and green line look like for something like native prairie. But what we do have is we have some monitoring data that would indicate what's the nitrate loss where we have prairie, a restored prairie versus a corn soybean cropping system. So kind of whet your appetite for something that's coming up here in a bit. Okay, it's also important as we think about field to stream nitrate loss, it is important to think about how does water move to that stream. And so in Iowa, we would kind of have a couple different soil conditions to think about. One would be naturally well drained, and then others would be soils with poor natural drainage. In those soils with poor natural drainage in Iowa and a lot of the upper Midwest, we have worked to make them a little bit more artificially well drained or artificially less poorly drained through the use of artificial subsurface drainage, commonly referred to as tile drainage. So what we have, if we look at the figure on the left, the naturally well drained, we get precipitation, we get infiltration of that water. That infiltrating water, if it moves below the plant root zone, may take nitrate with it, and then that might be delivered through lateral flow to the stream or through deep percolation to shallow groundwater, and then could move to the stream or could move to deeper groundwater sources. Where we have soils with poor natural drainage, where we have that artificial subsurface drainage, we still get that precipitation, we get that evapotranspiration, still have some surface runoff, but that infiltrating water would be intercepted by the subsurface drainage and delivered right to the stream. And so we are short-circuiting some of those natural flow pathways. It's important to note, though, that that one on the left, the naturally well-drained, we still lose nitrate below the plant root zone in those cases. It's just that it might move to the stream or move to a water body, perhaps groundwater, through a different pathway than what we see with the subsurface drainage system. Okay, so I talked about this 45% reduction goal for the hypoxia task force and for reducing the size of that hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So back in 2010, a group of researchers from Iowa State University, ARS, and then other entities started to look at what could we do to reach these goals? What practices could we implement, and how effective might they be in reducing nitrate delivery to downstream water bodies? And so this slide here just kind of illustrates, shows the estimated nitrate concentration reduction that we'd expect to get from a range of practices based on monitoring data from sites in Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, so states in the surrounding region here. So we'd have similar soils and similar precipitation patterns. And so these kind of grade from kind of that yellowish color are more of our infield 4R practices, right source, rate, time, and place of nitrogen application. And then we start moving into things like cover crops, extended rotation, maybe perennial system, perennial energy crops, pasture. And then those practices in blue down at the bottom are more infrastructure or practices where we are intercepting that nitrate before it's delivered to downstream water bodies. So we might call those edge of field practices. So as we look at this, it's important to note, kind of look at the estimated percent reduction we might get. If we look at some of our 4R practices of an inhibitor or side dress, or maybe moving from fall to spring, we're looking at about maybe a 5 to 10% reduction in nitrate loss or concentration from that system where we implement that 4R practice. If we think like something like cover crops, then from our review at that time, it was about a 30% reduction. Extended rotations was a little over a 40% reduction, where we looked at extended rotations versus a traditional corn soybean cropping system. And then you see those perennial-based systems really get us a big reduction. But in that case, that would be taking some land out of production. So as we look at this, and as we looked at it, it's very evident that we're going to need a range of practices. And really, it's important for producers, for those of you working with producers, to think about what may work on their individual farm. What might they be able to implement? Where might they be able to implement it to provide the greatest benefit to downstream water quality, as well as help their overall production system? So as we think about this, the types of practices are going to vary a little bit, or what I should say is there are going to be some situations where there are practices at our disposal that are not there, that wouldn't be there in other areas. So for areas with tile drainage, we would have that infield nitrogen management, the 4Rs. We would have things like land use practices, but then we'd have these edge of field practices that we'll talk about. But areas without tile drainage, we're really limited to that infield nitrogen management and land use. So I think it's important as you assess your farm, or you're working with somebody about practices they might be able to implement. If you don't have tile drainage, some of these edge of field practices may not be suited for, likely most of them would not be suited for that land. So it's better to not spend a lot of time thinking about those and thinking about how they might work on your individual property. Okay, so now we're gonna take a little tour of Iowa virtually here, and it's cold, so it'd be great to be out at these sites and you could see them, and so hopefully someday you can come out to a field day at one of these sites. But we're going to look at some of our drainage water quality data to give you an idea of how some of these infield nutrient management, nitrogen management practices might help us in reducing nitrate loss, and maybe why, again, kind of thinking back, why we have some of the challenges we do. So the first site we're going to talk about is our Gilmore City Drainage Research Facility, ongoing continuous monitoring since 1990. So that really installed with support from the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, and they have been instrumental in supporting the work there for the last 30 plus years. So I feel very fortunate that I've been able to work there since 2003, and my predecessors really helped get this site established. And so one of the things that this long-term data allows us to do is to look at how do things kind of change over time, or do they? And so this is looking at a 30-year summary. So, we feel like blessed to be able to look at something 30 years in length, because usually it's maybe a 3-year study, maybe 5 years if you're lucky. So here we have 30 years of data. This is the drainage in green, the square, the nitrate nitrogen concentration, the circle in blue, and the nitrate nitrogen loss, the triangle in kind of orange red. So this is the annual drainage nitrate concentration or loss from the combined corn soybean cropping system, where we had pretty much the same nitrogen management this whole time, where we had an early season side dress at about 150 to 160 pounds of N per acre to that corn crop. So what you see is that green line varies a lot, right? So annual precipitation varies. As a result, the annual drainage varies a lot. So you can see, our high was in 1993. Some of you may be far too young to remember, or maybe weren't even born in 1993. But historic flooding in Iowa, so we had about 27 inches of drainage that came out of that system. So you can think of this is somewhat analogous to precipitation. So, kind of how much, if we were to, put that water on top of the soil, we had about the equivalent of 27 inches of drainage in that year. We probably had over 50 inches of rainfall at the site in that year. 2018, similar, about that same drainage. Okay, you can see that red line follows closely, like the trend follows closely to drainage. And this goes back to that flow being a primary driver of how much nitrate loss that we see. And so, those years with higher flow generally have more nitrate loss. But we can see that nitrate concentration does vary from year to year, with a low of about 7 parts per million in 1993 to a high of about 21 in 2013. So those years where we had continual wet with a lot of drainage, we kind of flushed nitrate out of that system, so we had lower nitrate concentration. Whereas a year like 2013, we saw kind of quite an increase from 2012 to 2013 in nitrate concentration following a drought. So 2012 was dry, we got early spring precip and drainage in 2013, those nitrate concentrations were high. We would expect perhaps similar to happen in the spring of 2021 if we get drainage and rainfall. So what's important to note here is that 10 milligrams per liter, or parts per million, is the drinking water standard if we were to drink directly what's coming out of that drain. And so in most years, the nitrate concentration is above that drinking water standard. And that's even with what we would consider pretty reasonable nitrogen management for that system. So it really illustrates the challenge that we have with just some of our nitrogen management in reaching, say, a drinking water standard of 10, and how things can vary from year to year. So if we think about those 4 R's of, rate, source, time, and place of nitrogen, one of the critical ones is the rate of nitrogen application. And so in this curve, what we're doing is relating the flow-weighted annual nitrate concentration from a combined corn-soybean cropping system to the nitrogen application rate to corn in that corn-soybean system. And we can see that as we increase nitrogen application rate to that corn, we see higher nitrate concentration. And so it really, I think, illustrates that we need to be careful about the nitrogen rate that we apply, and we need to be thinking about, how can we optimize that nitrogen rate? How can we maximize or optimize yield while, say, minimizing our inputs of nitrogen? And so I think that's very critical as you think about, your land or working with producers, thinking about, are there opportunities to reduce some of that nitrogen application? And some of that may be by better timing that, putting it on in the spring versus the fall. Maybe we can put on a little bit less. So just be thinking about some of those things. But, as we look at it, the nitrogen that we apply, if we increase that rate, we'd expect to see higher nitrate concentrations coming from the system. This curve is also critical, and I think important. One other factor is if you look at that intercept, or what happens when we apply no nitrogen in a corn-soybean cropping system, we still get about 7 or 8 parts per million nitrate nitrogen on average coming from that system. This is getting back to these relatively high organic matter soils. There's some susceptibility of nitrate loss even when we don't apply any nitrogen in our annual cropping system, our corn-soybean cropping system. So 45% reduction. If we were to go from, say 150 pounds of N per acre to no nitrogen application, that might be about a 40% reduction. Okay, I would, ask, would you at least grant me the most aggressive form of nitrogen management is no nitrogen? Okay, if we were to try to solve or reach our goals of a 45% reduction with just infield nitrogen management in Iowa, we might have to go to almost no nitrogen application, which really illustrates why we need some of these other practices that we're gonna jump into here in a bit as well. And one of these is cover crops. And so we've been monitoring cover crops at our Gilmore City site for the better part of 10 years now. And so this looks at cumulative nitrate loss where we had a conventional tillage system versus a conventional tillage with a winter cereal rye cover crop system. And you can see even in the almost the northern latitudes of Iowa, northern areas of Iowa, we're still seeing a nitrate reduction when we implement that winter cereal rye cover crop. Okay. Now we're going to go to our Northwest Research Farm. This is a study that we've been looking at since 2015, where we have 4 different nitrogen management treatments. We have a fall anhydrous with nitropyrin, spring pre-plant anhydrous, split application, and then no nitrogen application. And all of the first 3 treatments all have a nitrogen application rate to corn of 135 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Okay? So as we look at this, if we average over the corn-soybean cropping system from 2015 to 2019, what we see is no difference in flow-weighted annual nitrate concentration, or no statistically significant difference between fall N and spring N. 2 factors. One, same nitrogen application rate in the fall and the spring. The other is that that fall N application did not go down until soils were 50 degrees and cooling. I would also say it's not shown here, but the corn yield was the same, or no statistically significant difference between the fall N and the spring N. Okay? We do see if we split that nitrogen application, we're seeing a reduction, maybe about 20% in this case from this study, in nitrate, flow-weighted annual nitrate concentration when we compare the split N to that fall or spring N. So this is good news. This is showing that if we implement these 4 R's, thinking of timing of nitrogen application, especially moving to some in-season N, we may be able to help reduce nitrate concentration. So something to think about as you're thinking about your nitrogen management system. Again, if we look at no nitrogen, it's the lowest for a flow-weighted annual nitrate concentration, but certainly not 0. And it's again in that 7 to 8 parts per million or milligrams per liter range if we average it over that period from 2015 to 2019. So, this summary kind of indicates, some of those 4 R's, especially maybe here the timing of split application may help us with reducing nitrate concentration that's in that drainage water and ultimately gets to the stream. Okay, now we're near Ames, so we just moved from Northwest Research Farm to our comparison of biofuel system near Ames, where the treatments I'll show you here looked at continuous corn with a winter cereal rye cover crop, and then 2 treatments where we have prairie. So in 2009, it seems like yesterday, but it's 11 years ago now, more. Spring of 2009, we put in new drainage system at this site. It had all been bulk cropped. That went in April of 2009. About a week or 2 later, 8 of the 24 plots were seeded with a diverse prairie mix, local ecotype, and then they've been prairie since then. All of these treatments here get biomass removed at the end of the crop year. So there's corn stover that's harvested in the continuous corn, and then the prairie after killing frost many years is mowed and then baled to look at biomass production there. So a couple things we see here. Even in that continuous corn, we are seeing cover crop help us reduce nitrate loss from the cumulative being about 140 with continuous corn and about 110, 115 with continuous corn with cover crop. Then if we look at our prairie, we are down less than 10 pounds of nitrogen per acre cumulative over that period from 2010 through the end of 2019. So it's very dramatic reduction. Our perennially based system greatly reduces the nitrate loss that we see coming from that system. I've been asked before, what do we see? What would we expect for nitrate loss from prairie? Well, we've been studying it for 10 years, and we see very little nitrate loss when we have that prairie. I'll also add that fertilized prairie, so the bottom line in purple, I should have it more of dashed so it's easier to see, but the purple one is fertilized prairie where we apply about 75 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year to try to maximize above ground biomass. But even when we do that, we still see very little nitrate loss. So if we could see more perennially based systems, whether that be pasture, maybe in the future, perennially based biomass production may greatly help us in reducing nitrate loss from our systems. Okay, now we're going to talk a bit about some of our edge of field practices. So now if we're gonna make these reductions, we got to do the best job we can in field with our 4 R's. We need to implement things like cover crops. Maybe in certain areas we can get to diverse cropping system, implementing maybe a clover for a year or 2 or small grains, and then also maybe a perennially based system that would help as well. Now that water and nitrates in our drainage system, what can we do to treat it or reduce the delivery of nitrate to downstream water bodies? That's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, the first edge of field practice we're going to talk about is drainage water management, where what we're going to do is try to control or manage the outflow from the drainage system during certain times of the year. Now, in the winter or maybe some summer months, we don't need full drainage, and we can hold some of that water back in the soil and reduce, the delivery of that nitrate to the stream. Okay? And so we've been studying this down at the Southeast Research Farm. So down in Southeast Iowa, we have a conventional drainage system, the controlled drainage where we have these outlet controls, and then we have what I would call almost a year-round controlled drainage system, so which is shallow drainage. So we have shallow drainage. We have drains at 2.5-foot drain depth versus a 4-foot drain depth for the conventional or controlled drainage. The shallow drainage, we do put them a little closer together to try to get the same rate of drawdown following a precipitation event. Okay, so we have been studying this for a number of years. This shows the annual average drain flow from 2007 through 2017, calendar year 07 through 2017. The top is the drain flow graph. The bottom is the nitrate nitrogen loss graph. And so what we see is we can get on the order of a 50% reduction in direct drain flow where we have controlled or shallow drainage, and we might get commensurate or similar nitrate loss reduction. So the delivery of nitrate, at least through the drain, might be reduced 50% where we have controlled or shallow drainage. Still some questions where that water and nitrate is going, but at least direct delivery from the drain is reduced. Okay, we got a subsurface drainage bioreactor, or you can kind of think of it as a wood chip trench that we're going to route drainage water through and promote denitrification. So this is a video of August 2019 at our Northwest Research Farm where they're installing a bioreactor. You can see the wood chips. We got a big wood chip trench, maybe 20 foot wide, 100 foot long, 3-4 foot deep. We're going to fill that with wood chips and route drainage water through there and promote denitrification. So you can see here putting those wood chips into that big trench. Okay. And when we do this is kind of some of the preliminary data that we see from that specific bioreactor. There is a NRCS practice standard out there for bioreactors, for the design of bioreactors, operation of bioreactors, and there are available cost share dollars, state and federal, to try to get more bioreactors in there. And so this just shows the black line circles show the inflow nitrate concentration going into the bioreactor. The upside down triangles show the outlet concentration coming out of the bioreactor. And so what we see is that nitrate concentration being reduced for that water that goes through the bioreactor. You'll notice there in kind of late March 2020, hardly any nitrate reduction then. That would be a period where we probably have high flow. And so with the higher flow, that retention time, or the amount of time the water is in there, is reduced. And so we're not getting as much nitrate reduction. We've also been looking at this at the Northeast Research Farm for a longer period of time. And so in this case, our mean influent concentration of nitrate is about 14 milligrams per liter, parts per million, and the outflow is about 7. You'll see some of those periods, the black and the white circle or clear circle, are pretty close to each other. Those would be periods, again, when we probably have higher flow, so the retention time is less. But these wood chip bioreactors can help us in reducing downstream nitrate delivery. Another one is saturated buffers, and in this case, we are intercepting that tile line before it gets to the stream. We're going to put a control structure in there and route that drainage flow along the upstream edge of the buffer and promote shallow groundwater flow. Again, trying to promote uptake of nitrate or denitrification as that water moves from the upstream edge of the buffer to the stream. So we're kind of artificially raising that water table below the buffer to promote lateral flow and to promote nitrate removal. So the real leaders in this work are Dr. Dan Janes, that is recently retired from the USDA Agricultural Research Service, and Dr. Tom Eisenhart, that is with Iowa State University. And so this is showing kind of that nitrate reduction as we move from the left, which is the pipe. Okay, so that's that pipe along the upstream edge of the buffer. And then what they did is they monitored the shallow groundwater as they moved from the pipe all the way to the stream. And so in this case, when they were 20.9 meters or a little over 60 feet from the pipe, there was hardly any nitrate in that shallow groundwater. Now, then the stream, where you're getting water from the upstream area, not just from that shallow groundwater, you can see that was about 12. But you can see as we move from 0 to 1.8 meters to 3.7, 5.8, 13, and then 20.9, we see that nitrate concentration in that shallow groundwater decreasing dramatically. So again, these saturated buffers are a great concept for nitrate reduction There's a great tool online. If you just use your search engine and type in saturated buffer viewer, the USDA Ag Research Service, Mark Tomer and David James and others have a saturated buffer viewer online where you could look at stream segments, and they tried to estimate based on soils information, maybe bank height of the buffer or the stream bank height, where there might be suitable locations for saturated buffers on our stream. So if you have land with a stream, you could go on there and look, might this be a suitable location for a saturated buffer? Okay, now we're moving a little bit more downstream, and we're looking at targeted wetland restoration. And so this is work that's been led by a colleague of mine, Bill Crumpton, at Iowa State University. What we're looking at is putting in a wetland where we can intercept subsurface flow and surface flow and promote denitrification and reduce downstream nitrate delivery. And so in this case, we might target that wetland restoration at the base of a watershed where we can capture that surface and subsurface flow. And we can hopefully dramatically reduce nitrate that's delivered downstream. This just shows a picture of one of these. And so as we think about some of these practices, I think it's important to think about what are some of the other benefits that may be accrued by these practices. And so certainly with these wetlands, they may provide a lot of other ecosystem services, such as wildlife habitat, waterfowl habitat, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but maybe some aesthetic value out there as well. Okay, similar to saturated buffers and bioreactors, the nitrate reduction that we see of the water that goes through the wetland, it's going to be a function of one major factor is how long is the water in there, okay? And so if you have a wetland that is bigger in comparison to the watershed area that's coming in there, that water may be in that wetland longer than if you have a small wetland, and a bigger upstream area. Also, if you have a drier year, there may not be as much water coming through there. That water that does come through there may be in there longer versus a wetter year. So you can see this curve as a percent nitrate removal as a function. It's actually a function of hydraulic loading rate, but you can think of it as in terms of a larger wetland or drier year or smaller wetland, wetter year. You can see that curve. If Dr. Crumpton looks at this for wetlands that occupy the wetland itself is about 1% of the landscape or 1% of the area from which water's coming from up above, we might expect that wetland to remove about 50% of the nitrate that's coming in. So we might also have a buffer around that wetland that might take another couple percent, but we might be able to reduce nitrate delivery downstream on the order of 50% by taking 3 to 4% of the land and putting it into a wetland and buffer around there. So could be a pretty good practice for us to implement, and I think we'd have many locations where this might work. I would also add that these wetlands, there's state and federal programs that are actively working to get these implemented. Specifically, the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship through their Iowa Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, which is a partnership between IDALS and the USDA Farm Service Agency, has been working for nearly 20 years to work on CREP wetlands, targeted restoration of wetlands. Kind of the most emerging practice for these edge of field is drainage water recycling, where we're capturing that drainage water, putting it into maybe a storage pond, and using that for supplemental irrigation. So we're just starting the research on this. So this is an emerging practice, but one maybe to think about. With this, we're putting that water back into the field, so we're reducing downstream nutrient delivery. How much we reduce downstream nutrient delivery is gonna be impacted by how big the reservoir is. And so some of us were part of a study that looked at this from some modeling work, estimating nitrate delivery in Iowa and Indiana. So on the left is Indiana, on the right is southeast Iowa. And so the dashed line in those is the mean percent reduction in nitrate. And so, for example, if we had a reservoir about 10% of the land area in Indiana, it'd be expected to reduce nitrate delivery downstream about 40%. In Iowa, if it was 10% of the land area, we might expect about a 25% reduction in downstream nitrate delivery. So, as we get bigger, we can store more of that water, we can reduce downstream nitrate delivery, but we're taking more land out of production. So, we're actively looking at what size of reservoir do we need to enhance crop production in the field for that supplemental irrigation, while minimizing the cost, but also getting downstream nitrate benefit. Okay, so as you think about, what might work best for you, and as we've talked about some of these practices, you might say, well, what about, how might that work on my farm? Which one might be best? I'd encourage you to go have a look at the Whole Farm Conservation Best Practices Manual. You can find it on the ISU Extension store. You can download that. You could get in touch with myself or Liz Ripley with the Iowa Learning Farms, and Liz may be able to get you sent out a hard copy of this. I think it's a great resource. Kind of walks through in kind of a flow chart format what, if you have a piece of land, what might work best for you. So, this is one on edge of field practices. Could edge of field practices work for you? So, what's your goal? If your goal is just habitat, maybe you go for something like a wetland, a saturated buffer, a prairie strip. If it's, habitat water quality improvement plus, then you might say wetland, saturated buffer, bioreactor, prairie strip in there. And so it could help guide you. Then there are more flow charts about thinking about your individual property and whether this practice would work there. Hopefully what it does is it serves as a resource to guide you to what practice might work in that area. And then if you go into your Soil and Water Conservation District Service Center, or the NRCS office, might help prioritize what practice you talk to them about implementing. Okay, another couple things here as we kind of get close to wrapping up, just to kind of let you know about some of the work that's going on and maybe some of what we need to do in the future as we think about scaling this up and trying to reach some of these goals. So we have a project funded by the USDA, NRCS, and the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. The Iowa Learning Farms program is working on this in conjunction with Dr. Bill Crumpton, who's doing a lot of this monitoring. And so Dr. Crumpton monitors a number of these wetlands, and these CREP wetlands I talked about. And the inflow to the CREP wetland is the outflow from a watershed, a small watershed. Okay, so that would be monitoring the delivery of nutrients from that watershed to the downstream water body, which would be, right upstream of the wetland. And so 3 to 4 years ago, we started looking at a couple of these sites in Story County and Floyd County to look at what happens if we start to implement conservation practices in the watershed. Can we see a difference in the downstream water quality, or the water quality that's delivered, into one of these wetlands? So started working with landowners in one watershed in Floyd County, one watershed in Story County, to implement practices on their land. So for example, here's our Floyd County watershed, where as part of this project in the fall of 2017, we saw some implementation of cover crops in about 60% of the watershed. So actually greater than that. About 77% of the watershed now gets cover crops. Also implemented some strip till and some CRP. So we've been monitoring that since that point in time. And so what this shows is the flow-weighted annual nitrate concentration from the control watershed or the treatment watershed. So the control watershed, we're calling the watershed where we've not implemented any intervention or any, working with the landowners to change and put in cover crops in particular. The treatment one we have. So what we see is that, we kind of see this trend pre-implementation before we did anything, and then we see post-implementation. And what we would hope to see is that those lines start to diverge, or the treatment watershed, maybe we see less nitrate than we do from the control watershed. We've not seen that to date, at least through the 2018-2019 calendar year. So this is the flow-weighted annual nitrate concentration for each of those calendar years. If we look at the April, May, and June, so this would be looking at flow-weighted annual nitrate concentration for April, May, and June. Again, pre-cover crop, post-cover crop, so you can see where that pre and post start. Again, somewhat similar trends. Maybe in 2020 in Story County, maybe there's some diverging of those curves, but really not much yet. So why? Why might that be? We've implemented between, say 40 to 70% of that watershed with cover crops. Why are we not seeing a reduction in nitrate concentration compared to our control watershed? I think a couple factors. One is I think there's some lag time. There may be some time before we see that difference downstream. The other may be some of these years were not the best cover crop growth years. And so that may influence how quickly or when we see positive impacts of that cover crop. And so we do know from some of our plot level research, the more biomass we get with our cover crop, the greater nitrate reduction we can get with that. And so in a lot of these years at these locations, we didn't unfortunately get the best cover crop growth. So hopefully we see better results into the future, but something to keep an eye on. And last, I want to bring up, kind of highlight some work that's being done at Iowa State University, and there are a lot of collaborators around the Midwest in some of this, but Emily Zimmerman, that's a faculty member here at Iowa State University, has done some work in this area and working with USDA Ag Research Service with this agricultural conservation planning framework. And so this ACPF are a set of GIS tools that one can use to cite where practices might be best placed on the landscape to have the greatest reduction in downstream nutrient delivery. And so this is some slides here from Dr. Zimmerman's paper that highlighted some ACPF for a watershed, Big Creek watershed in central Iowa. And so this shows the land use, the general land use for the Big Creek watershed. To give you kind of a point of reference, in the upper left corner there, that's the city of Boone, or community of Boone. I guess one might not call it a city, but the community of Boone. Okay, so with this, what they can look at is, where is there a high risk of nitrate loss, and then where might there be opportunities for implementing some of these practices, and then on the right might be the priority. Are they a very high priority, or maybe a lower priority? If maybe there's not as much risk of loss of nitrate from those sites, maybe they're a lower priority site. And then using this information, using the information on land use and so forth, also can potentially cite where practices might be placed. So this shows a blow up for a specific area, Big Creek, where a wetland might work. So there shows then that brown where a wetland or wetland buffer might be. And then downstream from that shows where we might be able to put saturated buffers. Okay, and then kind of that lighter tan are areas where cover crops could be used. And so you see those really on all of the acres in the Big Creek watershed. So as we kind of put all of this together, what you may ultimately have is something like this, which illustrates locations that are critical and high priority. So those are kind of those browner areas. The blue is where we might see a wetland or saturated buffer that might be able to be placed. And then in this case, that lighter tan colored are areas that are wetland drainage areas. So those would be the contributing areas into a wetland. So you can see if we put some of those wetlands in, we could be treating water from a pretty large portion of that watershed and reducing downstream nitrate delivery. So as we think about nitrate reduction field to stream, we want to think about where can we put those practices and where could they have the greatest benefit. And I think these tools like ACPF may really help us do that in the future. So I would just kind of encourage you to be on the lookout if you see some information about watershed projects in your area and the potential for use of some of these ACPF tools for citing of practices where they may be able to provide the greatest benefit. They're working on some aspects to also look at incorporating cost and where might these practices be placed to provide us the lowest cost solutions for reducing downstream nitrate delivery. So as we think about this, we have this 45% reduction. It's important for us to think about what's the payoff. And so I see many payoffs. One is improved local water quality. So a lot of this may be done for hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico, but we're also helping to improve local water quality, whether that be for recreation, drinking water. So there is absolutely a local benefit in reducing nitrate export from our landscape. Some of these practices really help us protect our soil resources. Things like cover crops may help us with soil quality, soil health. So we're protecting the long-term asset of the land out there, as well as reducing downstream nitrate delivery. And if we're going to implement some of these practices, I see potential employment opportunities, whether that be in designing some of these practices, working with landowners, on how we implement cover crops, designing things like wetlands or bioreactors or saturated buffers, designing and managing things like drainage water recycling. Implementing all of these would help us have a more diverse landscape out there as well, which can be appealing for many by having some diversity, maybe more habitat for waterfowl, wildlife, those types of things. So I guess kind of the summary of this, if we want to reach these goals, it's going to take a broad implementation of multiple practices. So if we think back to the performance of one individual practice, there's very few that give us 45% unless we convert a lot of land into a more perennialized system. So we're really going to have multiple practices, really thinking about what might work on your individual parcel of land, and again thinking about opportunities that might enhance or protect the long-term value of the land. So some of those practices that maybe help us protect soil or enhance soil quality might help us protect the long-term value of the land. And then kind of thinking about this economic value. I think there are some potential rural economic benefits, whether that be through jobs, by implementing some of these practices, or if we improve and have better habitat, better water quality, maybe some of the recreation benefits that we get from that as well. So I certainly thank you for taking the time to listen today. Hopefully you get your soil and water credit for those that need soil and water credit. This is my contact information, mhelmers@iastate.edu. Also on Twitter, ISU Ag Water Management. So feel free to reach out and get in touch if you have questions or comments. With that, look forward to some questions here at the end of our session. I thank the organizers for putting on Crops TV. Certainly in 2021, next winter, in 2021, 2022, hopefully we can see each other in person.